Intro. I'm Tyler from Big Bluff Ranch, and I've spent the last 20 years raising and managing landscapes here in Northern California. And among all the other things I've learned, I know a little bit about cover crops. And that's what we're going to talk about today. What is a cover crop? So, anytime you see an open field, that's a bad thing. A cover crop is the act of covering your land with plants for the purpose of soil health. What happens is when plants are growing, they're capturing sunlight, they're turning sunlight into food and then feeding the soil microbes, all of the protozoas and the bacteria and the fungi and all this cool stuff down in the ground. So this microbiome, this is like the heart of where sunlight meets dirt that gets turned into soil, that gets turned into food. So these soil microbiomes, they do all sorts of amazing things. They reduce soil erosion, they increase water infiltration. They get in there and they actually break apart rocks and make phosphorus available to the plants. So, side note, you have really healthy soil microbiomes, you don't need synthetic fertilizers. So ultimately, by feeding the bugs and the animals in the soil, the microscopic bugs and animals in the soil, we can grow more food for everyone, for them, for animals, for humans. It's amazing. Why use cover crops? So why should we be using cover crops and why aren't we using them now? Well, the thing to know is that the only free energy we get on planet Earth is sunlight. And the only way we can capture that free energy and do something useful with it is through chlorophyll. And the only place on land that we get chlorophyll is in green leaves. Really, our job as agriculturalists specifically, and as humans in general, is to encourage as many green leaves to be growing as long as possible. So cover crops help us achieve that in two ways. The first one is that most kind of conventional farming, they will have what they call fallow periods, where they've got their cash crop, their grain crop out, they've disced up the ground and they just leave it barren, no plants growing in it, waiting for their next cash crop. Well, bad things happen there. The sun is basically hitting that ground and doing nothing good. We're not getting any life out of that photon of energy from the sunlight. So by putting a cover crop in when that ground is traditionally fallow, we're capturing the sunlight, we're putting nutrients into the soil, we're making all of our microbiota happy. The cool thing about that is that you can take that crop and you can either lay it down as green manure for fertilizer, you can graze it off with animals and sell meat, or you can just kind of let it sit there. But the idea is that the cover crop has taken all of this sunlight energy and soil minerality and turned it into plant food. It's turned it into literally fertilizer. When you come in with your cash crop, your ground is ready to grow a great crop without the same amount of synthetic fertilizers. Basically, you have to use less or no synthetic fertilizer, same or higher yield. So it's more profitable for your bank account. It's better for our environment. And it's more nutrient dense for food for you and I to eat. So cover cropping is a key part of an overall system of regenerative agriculture. Basics of cover cropping. So what are the basics of cover cropping? Well, as you can kind of imagine, there is a huge amount of tips and tricks and tools and techniques that you can dig into, but there's essentially three that I see as the most important. Number one, no bare soil. You always want a plant growing at all times. So do whatever you can to have a green leaf. The other thing is no monocrops. Just as you want diversity in your life, that's what your soil wants. It just doesn't want to eat potatoes all day long. It wants to have potatoes and steak and dessert and breakfast. And the only way it gets that is by having a mix of plant species. So never run a monocrop. And rule number three, and admittedly, I'm a little biased because I'm mostly an animal person, is that you'll always have animals on there. That the relationship between plants and animals and the soil microbes is this crazy, powerful, interconnected relationship. And that without animals, you're missing a key component of the feedback loop that draws all of these processes to a higher level of succession. As the simplest way of thinking about it is that you want it to look like Mother Nature, right? So when in doubt, you're like, what should my cover cropping system look like? Go find a chunk of Mother Nature that seems to be working really well and copy that. Basic plants. So basic plants that you can use in a cover crop. Well, any plant that has a green leaf has a role in cover cropping. So never let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So if you can get something in your ground and growing, use that, whatever it is. That's better than bare soil. But there are two very basic levels of plants. And I am not a plant scientist. If you are and you're watching this, just forgive my ignorance. Generally speaking, you have two types of plants. You've got legumes, which are nitrogen fixing. They are the ones that take nitrogen, which is a key component of fertilizer, out of the air and stick it into the ground. So legume, you're thinking alfalfa, peas, beans, these sort of things. They're great to have in your cover crop. Then the other main component of cover crops would be non-legumes, grasses. So there's a bazillion types of grasses. You're talking like ryegrass, oats, barley, wheat, all of these things. And actually some of those are grain crops, you probably noticed, but they all have a role in the soil biota. They all contribute something to what happens in the ground. You have all of these options, and that really the absolute best one, going back to one of my basic rules about cover cropping, is you want a diversity of these things. So they call them like cover crop mixes, or if you want to be, fun, you could call it a cover crop cocktail. But you want to basically take a bunch of different plants and put them out there, and that each one of them is going to fill a slightly different role in your cover crop scheme, will contribute slightly different things to your soil biota and contribute slightly different nutrients to either the humans eating the plants or to the animals eating the plants. So yeah, plants, there's all sorts of plants, but the cool thing about Mother Nature is it kind of figures it out over time. So just throw out a whole bunch of stuff. This is kind of the situation where, throw something against the wall and see what sticks. It's not a bad idea here. Basic tech of cover cropping. Basic techniques of cover cropping. The most important part of cover cropping is having a cover crop in the first place. So just get the seeds in the ground and good things begin to happen. But if you want to refine that a little bit more, here are the three techniques that most cover crop people are going to utilize. Number one, no-till farming. So this is the practice of not disturbing your soil surface. So if you think about plows and discs, basically your image of a farmer is on some sort of machine that is taking the grass that's growing, flopping it upside down, churning it up, and you're left behind with like the seed bed, just open, bare soil behind it. And that's no good. And the reason they do that is in order to make a seed bed, to make it easy for them to plant seeds. Because way back in the day, they didn't have all the technology we have. It was hard for them to plant only their crop. So we have currently these planters called no-till planters. So basically they can cut a furrow in the ground, plant a seed, and cover it up all in one pass without having to disc up all of the soil. So no-till is the primary way a farmer will use cover crops. And remember, when I talk about farming in Mother Nature's image, she doesn't really disc stuff up. Everything's always covered. She just throws seeds out and lets it grow where they grow. We're going to do a little better than that, but that's where this no-till comes from. The other technique that most cover crop people will use is animals. Going back to one of the concepts is that Mother Nature never farms without animals. So you want grass and animals and soil all working together. You want your animals in a controlled grazing system, which basically means fences and frequent moves to a new paddock. The other thing is crop rotation. So This is just anything. You do the same thing over and over and you just get tired of it. The soil is the same way. If it just grows corn after corn after corn after corn, right? The soil doesn't like that. You drain all the nutrients that corn is really meant for. So the best thing you can do is rotate your crops. So farmers will end up like 7-year rotations. You'll do 4 years alfalfa, 2 years of wheat, 1 year of corn, whatever it is. But crop rotation, that way you're always contributing something slightly different to your soil and also removing something slightly different from your soil every time. So those are your basic techniques of cover cropping: no-till, controlled grazing, and crop rotations. Some benefits of planting cover crops. Some of the benefits of cover crops, there's a lot of them, but basically here are 4 of the top benefits. Soil and soil fertility management. By having a cover crop, we are making our soil healthier. And that's just good all around. It grows better crops, grows happier animals. Mother Nature's happy. It's good stuff. The second big benefit is climate resilience, water infiltration. Think of your soil in this regard as a sponge. You want to soak up as much water as possible. The roots of the cover crops open up the soil structure. It can suck in more water. Once you have the water in the soil, that means you're reducing drought issues, you're reducing flood issues. You're going to be able to extend your growing season because you have more water in the soil profile. Just really good stuff happens when you can capture that water. Pest management. The way Mother Nature works is that she sends out species, animals to take care of the problem. So if you think you have a, pest plant, probably what's happening is Mother Nature is noticing that there is a imbalance in her system, and she is sending out her species that will take care of that problem. So if you can run a cover crop and basically make things healthier, your weed disease goes away, because weeds only exist, generally speaking, in bad situations. If you make a good situation, weeds don't really exist. The fourth benefit to cover crops is, call it ecosystem services. There should be a better name for it. In this, you're basically thinking about what the ecosystem can provide. So you're thinking habitat for wildlife, high quality food for us, quality food for our animals that we raise. It's a nebulous term, but basically encompasses everything, right? You make your soil happy, you make your plants happy, then your animals are happy, then we're happy, right? It's all comes down to that living leaf. So those are some of the benefits of planting cover crops. Deciding what to grow. How do you decide what to grow? This sounds like a simple thing, right? You're like, hey, I've got a list of plants. These plants do these things. I have this issue. I'll put this plant on this issue and I fix it. If you dig into it a little deeper, it's not really that simple a question anymore. Nature's complex. It has interlocking, interweaving systems. And if you change one here, a whole bunch of other things are going to get affected at the same time. So really what it comes down to is your management. What you choose to do on the land is the most important and the most powerful thing on your landscape. Way more powerful than any cover crop mix you come up with. Don't just throw some cover crop seeds out there and be like, oh, I fixed the problem. You have to be out there managing it. But how to figure that out, that's a big question. We'll leave that one aside. So anyways, as far as kind of like the details, you need to think about what issues going on. Do I have soil issues? Do I have water issues? Do I have fertility issues? Then I got to go research what sort of plants might address that. Am I talking about summer plants, root plants, all of these sort of things? Each plant has different roles. You can try and be complicated and make this happen yourself, but ultimately Mother Nature is going to decide what the right mix is. And then you have to figure out when you're going to implement it. How is it going to fit into your cash crop? Or if you're a backyard gardener, how's it going to fit into your winter garden or your summer garden? Like when it fits into things. And then you have to figure out how you're going to terminate this cover crop. Are you going to graze it if you have access to animals? Are you going to crimp it, which basically means lay it over and turn it into a green manure. Are you going to bale it? No, you're not going to bale it. Don't bale it. There's a whole list of reasons for a different video sometime, but baling hay is dumb. Don't do it. And then you have to figure out what you're going to come up with next. That the simple decision of your cover crop mix is not so simple when you really start digging into it. It's super important, but once you dig into it, you're going to quickly understand that to be a good manager of your landscape, it's not just as simple as throwing some seeds in the ground. Cover crop benefits. Cover cropping benefits. So cover cropping is one facet of what it takes to be a good landscape steward. Once you get into a cover crop situation where you're taking care of your soil, the microbes and the fungi and the mycorrhizal fungi inside the soil, you're going to start to see the benefits like soil erosion. The soil won't go across the landscape when it rains, that the bugs are going to glom onto it and say, hey man, don't take this away. I love this stuff. You're going to have an increase in soil fertility by having good plants. They're going to be like, okay, plants, I like you around. I'm going to go and I'm going to break down this rock and I'm going to pull out some phosphorus. I'm going to pull out some calcium and I'm going to give it to you. You're going to encourage that relationship. You're going to have soil quality increases. So basically, they call them soil aggregates. It's these little balls of all of this good stuff that grows around roots. And that is where you capture soil carbon and all sorts of amazing stuff. The more of these aggregates you get, this is a simplistic explanation, the healthier your soil is, the deeper it becomes. So soil doesn't deepen, it actually uppens. So what happens is plants grow, they put stuff on top, they put stuff on top, they put stuff on top. So soil actually grows just like a kid does. Water management. We're going to capture all of that water that hits the ground from the rain. Not all of it, I should say, but a lot of it. It's going to go into the soil profile where it's going to do good things. It's going to grow plants. It's going to keep springs recharged, aquifers recharged. It's going to let animals have something to drink all summer and fall because it's just slowly seeping out. Weed management. Instead of acres and acres of junk plants, which are actually Mother Nature trying to fix a problem, you go in there and fix that problem and you start to reap the benefit of having all these other good aspects going. So you can go in there with the cash crop appropriately and make some money. Farmers are driven by money, surprisingly enough. Disease management. Disease is just another symptom of an imbalance in the natural cycle. So if you can get in there and you can provide the good bugs in proportion to the bad bugs or the good insects in proportion to the bad insects, it all eventually cancels out. But you need to provide the overall environment where these forces of good and evil can balance out. You're also just going to see a lot of diversity in wildlife. No one wants to live in a monoculture. Every animal wants a little bit of this, a little bit of that for health. And that's what you get in a cover cropping situation. Just one simple example. All of those cover crops, generally speaking, they're going to have lots of flowers. Lots of flowers are going to be really good for bees. Bees are critically important to the food that we eat. It's what pollinates the food we eat. Just simplistically, if we can grow cover crops, make flowers for bees, our vegetable production is going to be better. And that's just one tiny example. So cover cropping is one angle into this whole big, awesome, amazing, interesting ball of regenerative agriculture. How are cover crops used in farming systems? So how are cover crops used in farming systems? Cutting edge farmers who are going back to the future or forward to the past, I say that jokingly because essentially cover crops are something early farmers used a lot. We've only kind of moved away from them recently because we were able to cheat with synthetic stuff. But these cutting edge farmers who are taking practices of the past and enriching them and taking them farther forward based on scientific knowledge, what are they using cover crops for? Well, ultimately, they're using it to improve their profitability. And that's not profitability of their bank account, which is absolutely true. Less inputs, more outputs, they're going to make more money. But this isn't profitability in a more general sense, profitability in their bank account, profitability in their life. Farming is not what you call an easy lifestyle. We are at the front lines of Mother Nature and the weather. So we're never really in control of our life. And we're also never really in control of how much money we make because we always just sell it to the commodity market, generally speaking. So that means you have no control of your inputs from nature and you have no control of your eventual prices, right? So you are really in a difficult position. By following cover crops, you still have some of these systemic issues, but by increasing your soil health, you are insulating yourself from the variations of Mother Nature. By increasing your gross margin, you're insulating yourself from the commodity market fluctuation and you're creating a more stable environment, a more stable health level, a more stable bank account. That allows farmers to do things that it's tough to do without cover cropping and regenerative agriculture. You can really think about creating a legacy for your family because that's what all of us farmers want. We want to be able to give our farm to the next generation. The other thing that you can do is that when you're not stressed about life, life is just easy. This is an amazing job to have as long as you're not stressed about losing the family ranch, which is not uncommon. Just as a small side note, farmers have one of the highest suicide rates of all professions. And it's because that we're between a rock and a hard place, where the rock is Mother Nature's variations that we can't control, and the hard place is the commodity prices that we can't control. And we're stuck there in the middle trying to make a living, and we can't control these two major components of our life. Cover cropping, regenerative agriculture gives us back some of that control. So that is the big reason to get into cover cropping, because you become more in control of your life and your business. How does Big Bluff Ranch use these magical cover crops in our pasture poultry operation? Well, it's actually a pretty important part of what we do. Chickens, believe it or not, are really rough on pasture. I realize they're small and you don't really think that they do all that much, but their feet are basically meant to rip and tear and dig into pasture. And so they just scratch up stuff and they can leave a pretty big mess behind them. And so what we do is we use cover crops to help restore the pasture. We use like a fast acting ryegrass that kind of grows up quick and sets everything up behind them. That's one way of using cover crops. The other way is that chickens just love fresh greens, right? It's not what they live on, but they love to eat it. Cover crops are basically a way for us to introduce a whole bunch of different plants for the chickens to just nibble on and enjoy and get a really yummy salad. The most significant thing is that chickens are really good at fertilizing the pasture. Chicken feed goes in, chicken fertilizer comes out the other end, and over fertilization can be a big problem. You don't want all of that nitrogen just floating around. It's just not going to do good things for the environment. You want a plant to grab onto that nitrogen and do something with it. So that's what we do. Cover crops use a lot of nitrogen rather than letting it off gas into the environment or run off into the water stream. We do all sorts of things to capture that nitrogen. So for us, the cover crops and plants and the animals are kind of woven together so that one benefits the other, and that if things happen right, you're just synergistically raising the level of all of those plants and animals just to be better and healthier and happier and more amazing for all of us. So, Big Bluff Ranch, we're not a small ranch. We're not huge by any means, but we're not small. We have many, many hundreds and thousands of acres of our ranch that we don't run our chickens on. So we use cover cropping, or we're testing using cover cropping on those acres too. The big issue we have out here is that we are not on the fertile, amazing class one soil of the Sacramento Valley that's just 20 miles away that supplies 80% of the world's almonds. We don't have that sort of fertility. We're up here in what our neighbor used to call chicken scratch country, which is kind of funny because we're raising chickens now. We are exploring and testing using cover crops on our extensive rangeland in a slightly different manner than what we use for our pasture poultry. On our rangeland, what we're trying to do is we're trying to draw forth more fertility from our soils. We have poor soils. There's not a lot of life in them. So what we're trying to use is cover crops as a jump start to just get that soil microbiome like rocking and rolling quicker than if we just ran cows appropriately, which would work. And it does work. And that's what Mother Nature's done all along. But the cool thing about being a human is we can understand why she's doing things, and we can take that knowledge and amplify it on her behalf. So that's what cover crops are doing for us here in our rangeland. We're using them to break down the minerals and the rocks in our soil to make them more bioavailable for our plants. We're using them to increase our soil microbiome. I mean, think of like earthworms. We want earthworms all over our rangeland. They're not there yet, but that's what we want to do. And if we can get all that stuff happening, that cover crop is doing all that below ground, and above ground, we're growing a whole bunch of more leafy stuff that cows can eat that can capture sunlight. And so we will be able to run more cows and eventually more goats and sheep on the same acreage by jump starting our soil health through the application of cover crops. The future of cover cropping. What is the future of cover cropping? People are starting to notice this. This is not a fringe movement anymore. For all the slightly less than perfect acts the government does, it has actually noticed the benefits of cover cropping. Here in California, there's a program called the Healthy Soils Program that actively encourages cover cropping through grants. We have been a part of that for the past couple of years, and we hope to apply and continue on with that program. The USDA, through the NRCS, they have programs that help support farmers do cover cropping. In the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, the EQIP program, they have practices, cover cropping, all sorts of good stuff for sustainable regenerative farming practices. They have another program called CSP. It's all acronyms. I can never remember. But the point is that if you are a farmer or know a farmer is interested in doing these practices and needs some financial assistance, the government has recognized the benefits of this and is willing to help you implement these, which is huge. I mean, the government's not great, but they got this one right. So go for it. The other thing is private companies are noticing. So there's these things floating around there called carbon credits, where basically farmers are being paid to store carbon from the air, and that cover crops are a key component in storing carbon. Basically, sunlight and carbon in chlorophyll gets turned into a simple sugar, which gets put in the ground, and that stores carbon, pulls it out of the air. You have less climate change. Big companies are making commitments to carbon credits. It was supposed to be in the Kyoto Accords. The U.S. didn't really sign it, but private companies are doing it on their own. Big ones, too. The future of cover cropping and regenerative agriculture looks good. Cool cover crop activities at BBR. So what is Big Bluff Ranch doing in the world of cover crops? The first thing we're doing is we're composting our chicken litter and spreading that on the rangeland. So we're helping our native range grow better, which in effect is a cover crop. We've done many USDA EQIP and CSP programs. It's pretty cool what the government's doing, putting money behind these good regenerative farming practices. We're always doing continuing education. My dad just got back from a soil health academy. We are also always messing around with cover crops with the chickens. We like to grow something behind them in order to utilize all of the excess fertilization they leave behind and get that all incorporated into the soil rather than having it turn into a bad gas or runoff or something silly like that. We just lock it up into plants. We've been rotating our cows for the past 40 odd years. So we are using a lot of kind of cover cropping methodologies already. What we want to do in kind of the immediate future is we want to start experimenting with cover crops on the rangeland. So our rangeland has a whole bunch of naturalized annuals. They're not really high quality. They don't have a big root structure. So what we can do is if we come in with a slightly higher quality level of plant and plant that on the rangeland, we can jumpstart the biology in the soil. We want to get involved with multi-species again. We want to get goats and sheep in addition to our cows, and that the idea is each one of these species eats a different plant at a different stage of its life. And basically, we're converting the free energy from the sun into different forms of life. And, we have hills, so the goats and the sheep can do the hills. The sheep like the little forbs, the goats like the brush, and turns all of those green leaves into something useful. We want to reintroduce native perennials to the rangeland. The idea there is that through managing the grazing and through compost application and cover cropping, that we're increasing the life in our range soil, and we're trying to create conditions where these native perennials will just take off. We've done this with just our grazing management. We have a lot of these native perennials that have come back, but we can do a better job of it, which is pretty exciting. We're going to build more fences and do a lot more stock water systems. So if we can get stock water systems to different parts of the ranch, we'll be able to control the grazing better. And by controlling the grazing better, we'll be able to control how the plants grow better. And along the lines of that, we want to increase the sophistication of our grazing management. And that will be facilitated by stock water systems, multi-species, all that sort of stuff. There are so many things that we could do. All of those kind of future plans I just went through, those are all things that will help Mother Nature, but they will also directly help our bottom line. If we can put water where we can't run cows now we have more acres to run cows on. More cows means more things we can sell, which is great. But there are tons and tons of ideas that we could do that don't directly make us more money. And I would love to get into them. These are some of my fantasies that are cash depleting, but life encouraging. The one that always gets stuck in my mind is essentially being able to apply natural stimulants through a crop duster. So you can take compost, you make a tea extract out of it. So that tea is full of all sorts of good microbiota. You can fly that on, apply it, and it just inoculates and jumpstarts the soil health. You can do the same thing with some of the trace minerals. Yes, the cover crops and the plants can break down the minerals and turn it into the correct form for plants. But if you just fly it on, you can kind of jumpstart the process. The other thing these crop dusters could do is you could just fly on all of these cover crop seeds, because we can't actually drive on every acre of the ranch. In fact, we can only drive on a limited number of them. But this crop duster could fly everywhere. So we could get cover crop seeds over the entire ranch, which would be pretty cool. Then what I get excited about is mechanically jumpstarting Mother Nature's water systems out. So one idea is making trash dams. It's like when you were a kid, you made a little rock dam in the creek, or you put some branches across a creek. You come back the next spring, it's caught sediment. Let's do that on kind of a landscape scale and just imagine how much sediment we can trap. That sediment will create an area where we can grow deer grass, then we can grow willows, and we can grow cottonwoods, and that we can kind of re-energize all of our secondary riparian areas. Up on the rangelands, it would be pretty cool to build swales. Basically think little dams along the contour lines of your soil. So when the water kind of flows across the ground, it hits a dam, a very gentle one. And then instead of just keep running off into the creek, it stops, pools up, and sinks in. Mother Nature would do this on her own, but if we have the ability to step in and kind of jumpstart this sort of process. But it doesn't make us money directly. The amount of money it would take to build these things versus the amount of extra grass we would grow doesn't translate into how much extra cows we could sell. We'd lose money doing this, but it's a great idea and it would be amazingly fun to do. The other thing that I'd love to do would be species specific habitats for endangered species. We have red-legged frogs out here. We've got neotropical migrants, these little tiny Tweety birds that go from Mexico to Alaska. They need a spot to stop and rest. We could be that spot and just create more habitat for insects and birds and beetles and bugs and deer and bears and all that sort of fun stuff. What would be cool to do would be to make nest boxes for specific bird species, hidden water sources or protected private water sources for little tiny terrestrial animals so they can drink at night where they're safe and protected. There's a ton of things that we can do, and all that kind of stems from growing more roots, more soil life. And that is one of the plans or the fantasies that I have for what we would do here at Big Bluff Ranch.